Brittany, France, 1343. "My lord, this could be a trap," said your deputy Gaston as you stare down from your castle battlements at the woman below. Even the dying light cannot hide her beauty or the yearning in her bright blue eyes as she asks for sanctuary and to be let in. Jeanne de Clisson, widow of a recently executed traitor to the King of France, now herself hunted as a fugitive with a rich reward on her head. Once she strode around Breton as one of its most powerful aristocrats. Now, this once haughty beauty comes begging for your help. You silently laugh to yourself. The stupid woman doesn't know you were part of the very conspiracy that falsely accused her husband of treason and stole his lands. Now you can take his wife too. Once you are tired of the widow, the King of France will reward you greatly for her capture. You stare into the forest that borders the castle. It is dark, still, and seemingly empty of life. "You're behaving like an old woman again, Gaston. Open the gates and let her in." Greeting her in the courtyard, her beauty is even more striking, especially the look of desperate gratitude on her face. Yes, you will have some fun with her. Suddenly, an arrow streaks out of the forest and smashes into the throat of one of your soldiers as he gargles and collapses to the floor. Armed men pour out of the forest and barge into the castle before the gates can be closed. It was a trap. That dratted woman, she will pay. Before you can turn your fury on Jeanne, she appears in front of you, and a sharp, burning pain erupts in your guts. You look down in terror at the long dagger she has plunged into your stomach. As you slowly sink to the floor, her eyes are now as cold as a tomb, almost portals to hell. "This is for my husband," she snarls unblinkingly as she thrusts the knife in again. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. A wronged woman in medieval France, her husband accused of treason, and his estate seized by rivals, goes on an epic rampage of revenge that would lead to her captaining a pirate fleet in the English Channel. All the while, in the background, the 100 Years' War rages with all its violence, treachery and deceit. Sounds like a Game of Thrones episode, yet it really happened. Join me for Jeanne de Clisson's journey from aristocrat to fugitive widow to dread pirate of the seas. Jeanne was born in Brittany in 1300 to an ancient and noble family, the de Bellevilles. Today, Brittany is a region of France, but it was independent at this time. The Breton language, derived from Celtic, has more in common with Gaelic than French, so think Ireland and Scotland. It was kind of a frontier zone between England and France. The lords of Brittany were the first to help William the Conqueror invade England, and were rewarded with rich territories there. But while they had strong links to England, it was across the Channel. They shared a land border with France, and their aristocracy owned vast lands there as well. In truth, if you asked most residents of Brittany whether they felt English or French, most of them would have told you, "I am Breton." At the age of 12, practically an old maid by medieval standards, Jeanne was married to Geoffrey de Chateaubriand, the 19-year-old heir to one of the key defensive estates in the region. It was a typical aristocratic marriage, more of an alliance between families than a love match. She lived a conventional life for a woman of the noble class, and bore Geoffrey 2 surviving children, a son who inherited the Chateaubriand estate, and a daughter who inherited the Beville estate. It wasn't until her first husband died and she became a widow at the grand old age of 16 that things became interesting. Firstly, she remarried a widower, Jeanne de Clisson, in what was a genuine love match, very unusual among French nobles. Despite, by all accounts, a happy marriage, Jeanne was already showing the steel that would make her feared throughout France. She took her husband to court over monies promised to her in their marriage contract, and won. A rare accomplishment. Hopefully my wife doesn't get any ideas. Secondly, the marriage, and their joint wealth, made them one of the prime power couples in Brittany at a very dangerous time. The France of this period was very different from our own. Surprisingly little of the country was actually ruled by the King of France in Paris. Overmighty lords restricted his power and often defied him, none more so than the King of England, who controlled vast areas of North and East France. This was because of William the Conqueror, the victor of the Battle of Hastings and founder of the modern British royal family, who was also the Duke of Normandy, and passed his French lands on to his successors. Thanks to some successful wars and marriage alliances, those French lands had only grown until they outstripped even the territory controlled by the French king. This was an intolerable situation for the royal court in Paris, and King Charles IV of France made it his mission in life to try and seize control over English lands on the continent. Numerous clashes resulted, and he even made an alliance with the Scottish, threatening the Kingdom of England from the north. Tensions were already sky high, and finally exploded into war when a succession crisis erupted. The French king died in 1328, without leaving brothers or sons to succeed him. Nearest in line to the throne was Edward III, King of England. Given the already heated rivalry between France and England, the French nobility firmly rejected his claim, installing their own candidate on the throne as King Philip VI. Edward initially accepted this snub to keep the peace, but when the French annexed the region of Gascony, one of his most prized possessions in France, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. So began the 100 Years' War, which ironically, despite the name, lasted 116 years, plunging France into an era of bloodletting, famine, looting and disease. Brittany wasn't officially part of this war, but it was becoming increasingly hard to stay out, as they were right next to the war zone. Adding a further layer of complication, Brittany's noble families had lands in both England and especially France. Under the feudal system, you roughly owed allegiance and loyalty to whatever king or lord controlled areas where you owned land. Suddenly, both sides were demanding they pick, a very tricky choice to make. As the tensions rose, Brittany had its own succession crisis at just the wrong moment. It started off as a messy family feud straight from a soap opera. John III, Duke of Brittany, had no children himself and hated his half-brother, John de Montfort, who was from his father's second marriage. He even tried to get his father's second marriage retroactively annulled so de Montfort could be declared a bastard, but with no success. On his deathbed, he refused to name a successor, groaning that, quote, "For God's sake, leave me alone, and do not trouble my spirit with such things. End quote. Power hates a vacuum, and as the crisis in Brittany deepened, England and France soon looked to get involved. Exhausted by the war, they'd been forced into a 2-year truce negotiated by the Pope. But now Brittany was in play. Swords were being drawn again. There were 2 rival claimants to Brittany. The first was Charles de Blois, the man who had become Jeanne's archenemy, and a rather odd fellow. From an early age he was incredibly devout, so much so that his father banned him from reading any more books on religion. When he grew up, he took his piety to a whole new level, relishing causing himself pain and discomfort. This was surprisingly popular among the very religious in medieval times. He would place pebbles in his shoes, slept on straw instead of a bed, and wore a hair shirt that was designed to irritate the skin under his armour. He was even made a saint in the 20th century. But, to borrow from Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, he saw sin everywhere, except within. His piety hid a judgmental, jealous, and brutal nature, which would one day be turned on Jeanne and her husband. In the upcoming war, he would regularly order massacres and betray close friends at will. As the nephew of the French king, he was France's candidate, and was backed by most of the Breton nobility. The second candidate was John de Montfort, the half-brother the previous ruler had hated. He was backed by England, and by all those who didn't want Britain to be dominated by France. It was time for Jeanne and Oliver to choose de Montfort or de Blois, England or France. As both possessed extensive lands in France, siding with the English would immediately lead to the seizure of their estates by the French king. Plus, Oliver considered de Blois a friend, so they backed the French side. This was to prove their downfall. The strategic town of Vannes was a key target of de Montfort and his English allies. 4 times it endured sieges under the leadership of Oliver, until finally, in 1342, it was overwhelmed by the English. Normally, captured nobles were ransomed back to their family for vast fortunes, but Oliver got off surprisingly easy. Instead of a hefty ransom that his family would struggle to pay, he was exchanged for the first Earl of Stafford. This was, all things considered, a slightly unequal bargain for the English, but not unusual for this war. However, it was enough for Charles de Blois to become suspicious. He was already blaming the fall of Vannes on treachery, despite the fact it had held out 4 times before being overrun. It was a short leap for Charles to conclude that a friend whose power he had always been jealous of had betrayed him. Poor Oliver returned to Breton expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, his supposed friend was plotting behind his back. Soon, Charles de Blois was whispering in his uncle the French king's ear, poisoning his mind against Oliver, despite there being no actual evidence of his treachery. Just the suspicion was enough to mark him for death. During yet another brief truce between the warring parties, a grand tournament was organised to celebrate the peace. Jeanne de Clisson and 15 other Breton nobles were invited by the French king. Unsuspectingly, they walked straight into de Blois' trap. While travelling to the tournament, they were arrested by French soldiers and imprisoned in Paris. Jeanne sprang into action and tried to free her husband by bribing a French sergeant, but her plot was discovered and she was summoned to answer charges of, quote, rebellion, disobedience, and excesses against the king, public welfare, and the king's royal majesty, end quote. Perhaps wiser than her husband, she simply refused to attend and fled back to Brittany. By August 1343, without the public trial his rank should have given him, Oliver was convicted of treason, despite there being no evidence. The punishment was death. The church bells ring with deep, echoing finality. The solemnness of the bells is not reflected by the eager crowd, hungry for blood and entertainment, a festival-like atmosphere prevailing. You are a noble, come to watch the execution of 15 of your own class, out of solidarity with them, rather than for sport or loyalty to the crown. This shouldn't be happening. A noble not getting a public trial? It's unheard of. Your friend replies back cynically, You know what they say, when the war starts, the law falls silent. Best not to complain too much, or the king might take an interest in you. Suddenly, a great roar rises from the crowd. You can see that Oliver has been dragged out by soldiers. He wears only a cheap, flimsy white smock. The crowd jeers and pelts him with rotten vegetables. He takes the abuse stoically, showing no fear. As he mounts the wooden platform, the official reads out his supposed crimes. Lord Clisson is charged with several treasons and other crimes perpetrated by him against the king and the crown of France, and for alliances he made with the King of England, enemy of the king and of the kingdom of France. There is only one fitting punishment: death. May God have mercy upon his soul. As Oliver kneels down, the executioner raises his long, sharp sword and then swings it down. Thankfully, it only takes one blow as the crowd cheer. Oliver's body was carted off and raised on the highest gibbet in Paris. These were long, sturdy wooden structures from which bodies were hung from as a warning. His head was mutilated and then sent to Nantes in Brittany to be placed on a spike as a warning to all others of what awaited those who betrayed the King of France. 14 other Breton nobles suspected of treason were also executed on the same day, and their bodies similarly mutilated. Both the estates of Oliver and Jeanne were seized. Those in France went to the crown and the king's favourites, while those in Breton were distributed to Charles de Blois' henchmen, especially those who'd helped him frame Oliver and the other nobles. The execution shocked the nobility, as the evidence of guilt was not publicly demonstrated, and the process of desecrating or exposing a body was reserved mainly for low-class criminals. Yet, as Charles de Blois retired to his straw, safe in his own piety and goodness, he must have felt that he'd been completely successful. A devastated Jeanne took her 2 sons by Oliver to see their father's head in Nantes. Standing before all that was left of her husband, she swore by God and all that was holy that she would avenge his death and punish his betrayers. She herself had been convicted of treason and her estates confiscated. But she was independently wealthy, so she sold off her jewels and all that was left of her material wealth to strike back against Charles de Blois. She raised and paid for an army of 400 men made up of loyalists and the relatives of those other lords who had been unjustly killed. Her first target was one of Charles's leading supporters, Galois de la Housse. Why she picked him in particular is disputed in the sources we have. For the dramatisation at the start of the podcast, I used the version that says he played a leading role in framing her husband, secretly lusted after her, while benefiting richly from the stolen estates. Basically the chief lapdog and henchman of that epic villain Charles de Blois. But just so you know, there are other versions of this tale, such as it was just because he was so close to Charles, or it was pretty random. Appearing before the castle he controlled, she appeared to be alone and begged to be let in and for sanctuary. Dismissing her as a mere woman, what possible threat could she be? He opened the gates and let her in. He would soon realise the extent of his mistake. Beware of a woman scorned. Her soldiers stormed in and massacred everyone in the castle, with Jeanne personally killing Galois. Only one servant was left alive to tell Charles who was responsible. They melted into the forest before de Blois' soldiers could respond. Charles is alleged to have vomited after seeing the state of his former friend. Filled with bloodlust and righteous anger, she ravaged the Breton countryside, overrunning other castles loyal to de Blois and massacring their inhabitants. Her calling card was always to leave alive just one person, to spread the word of her deeds. Unable to stop her merry band, Charles the all-so-virtuous went running to his uncle back in Paris. Soon a whole French army was sent to hunt her down, a force so large she would have no chance against it. Disbanding her army, she came up with a new, daring plan. She had already allied herself with de Montfort, and through him she established contact with the English. With their help, and the loot she had taken from her rampage, she bought 3 merchant ships and converted them for war. The ships were painted black as night, and their sails were dyed a bright red crimson. Jeanne is said to have wanted them to appear like something out of a dark fever dream or a nightmare. Finally, she named her personal vessel My Revenge, before taking to the seas to begin a life of piracy. Her epic 13-year rampage would turn her into a legend, feared by the French and admired by the English. Sailing with her sons, the tragic widow, as she had become known in Paris, began her reign of terror by attacking French merchant ships in the Bay of Biscay on France's west coast. She was essentially waging a guerrilla war and hitting the French king where it hurt him most, cutting off the supplies to his armies and reducing the vital taxes from trade that was funding his war machine. Operating at first from a hidden family castle on the small island of Eure, her force took advantage of their expert knowledge of the local estuaries and islands to stalk their prey. The Black Fleet would suddenly swarm down upon an unsuspecting merchant ship, the crews equipped with grappling equipment for closing in, and weapons such as crossbows, swords, and daggers, so they could storm the now helpless vessel. In the lead was always Jeanne, who would earn herself another nickname, the Bloody Lioness of Brittany, after the sigil of the House Clisson. She displayed it on her shield, a white lion on a blood-red background. Your friend laughs as you stare anxiously out into the thick fog that surrounds the vessel. Annoyed, you round on him. I don't know what's so funny. Pirates are everywhere in these waters. He smirks. You don't believe all that rubbish about the Bloody Lioness, do you? A woman pirate? Ridiculous. He laughs uproariously. But suddenly, the laughter dies in his throat, and his face turns pale. He points behind you. Out of the fog, 3 ships have emerged, painted black and with blood-red sails. At the forefront of the largest ship is a woman with a red shield, a white lion burnished upon it. Terror grips your heart. It was all true. The crew rush on deck as you sound the alarm. Pirates! Pirates! But it is too late. Grappling hooks hold your vessel in place as the pirates yelling their battle cries leap abroad. The crew tries desperately to fight back, the deck a whirlwind of the clash of swords and the screams of the wounded and dying. But you are no match for the pirates. They slaughter the whole crew, until it is just yourself and the wealthy French noble who owns this ship, on your knees, surrounded by the dead bodies of your former shipmates. The Bloody Lioness approaches you. Her beauty would have taken your breath away, if not for the strange fires that burn in her eyes. The Lord tries to buy his way out. I am Charles, Duke of Avignon. My family will pay a large ransom for my release if I am harmed. Her eyes seem to flame with rage when she hears that he is called Charles. You can't help but think he has made a grave mistake. The lioness speaks. Her voice is clear and cold. My husband was of noble blood, yet that didn't stop your king from murdering him. It will not save you either. She picks up an axe as a spluttering noble is held in place, his head forced down. No, please, no. I can give you your weight in gold. A cruel smile on her face. She swings down the axe with relish. Horrified, you look down at the Lord's severed head, lying on the deck. If she could do that to a noble, what will she do to you? The lioness strolls over, the axe still dripping blood as it hangs loosely in her hands. I always leave one person alive. Tell everyone you meet what happened here. Tell everyone of the wrath of Jeanne de Clisson. Soon, she expanded her operations to the English Channel. Rumours swirled about her bloodthirsty nature. In some of the tales, Jeanne and her children personally oversaw the execution of the captured crews. In other tales, Jeanne swung the axe herself. As one scholar puts it, quote, "The only thing certain was that every day the number of ships that did not reach their destination increased." End quote. Jeanne could be particularly ferocious when dealing with captured French lords. Their noble bloodlines were supposed to protect them from butchery and mutilation, but that hadn't protected her husband, had it? One after another, Jeanne delighted in murdering aristocrats. Especially, so the rumour went, those gentlemen unfortunate enough to be named Philip or Charles. On December the 1st, 1343, King Philip had had enough. That day, the French Parliament formally declared open season on the Bloody Lioness. The French Navy filled the Channel and the Bay of Biscay, hunting Jeanne. Still, It would be years before they finally tracked her down. In 1346, long after the hunt began, English and French forces clashed at the Battle of Crécy. Who arrived to provision the English troops with fresh supplies? But Jeanne de Clisson and her Black Fleet. Once again she eluded capture. But finally, sometime around 1348, the French Navy finally caught up with her Black Fleet. The battle was long and hard. Deep into the night, fighting raged between the French and the Black Fleet. Holding out on her flagship, My Revenge, Jeanne refused to give up until almost all of her pirate fleet was dead. Finally, the French sailors fought their way onto her flagship and approached the captain's cabin. The Lioness appeared to be cornered. But once they broke in, they discovered it was empty. They searched the entire ship from top to bottom, but there was no sign of her. Where was Jeanne de Clisson? Where was the Bloody Lioness of Brittany? While the French were fighting their way through the ship's interior, Jeanne, her sons, and a crew of 6 pirates had escaped on a tiny boat heading out into the open English Channel. For 6 days the boat drifted through freezing water as the passengers edged closer to death. They had no food, they had no water, their wet clothes froze in the winter air. Finally, at some point in their desperate escape, Jeanne's youngest son died. After 7 days adrift, the crew finally landed. To their amazement, they washed ashore on a friendly stretch of the Breton coast, where they found supporters of John de Montfort to supply them with food, water, and warm clothes. Jeanne buried her youngest son on the coastline in a small, sad ceremony. There was no time for her to rest. She was still being hunted by the French and Charles de Blois. Brittany was getting too hot for the pirate queen. She headed for the safety of England under the protection of the king. Luckily for her, the French were about to be very distracted. Something even more lethal than the Bloody Lioness was about to hit France. The Black Death had arrived. Jeanne and her son hid out in an England that would lose 25% of its population to the Black Death. But that was a blessing compared to the tragedy across the Channel. 1/2 of the much larger French population succumbed to the disease. On his deathbed, King Philippe of France must have felt cursed for his execution of Oliver and the Breton nobles. Jeanne's rampage had severely hindered his war effort, and English victories were racking up. At the same time, his country was being consumed by death, inflation, a faltering economy, and disease. When he died, he left behind a much weakened France filled with unrest. Jeanne certainly had her revenge on him. That same year that Jeanne's fleet was destroyed, a battle took place that decided the fate of Brittany. Sir Walter Bentley scored a victory over a French army twice the size of his forces. His longbowmen inflicted mass carnage on the French cavalry forces, and Charles de Blois himself was captured. A long imprisonment in England beckoned before he could be ransomed. The English king richly compensated Sir Bentley with numerous Breton lands and castles. While he was inspecting his new estates, he met Jeanne, who was visiting family. Both heroes and legends in their own right. They fell in love and married. Now that's something right out of a Hallmark movie or a Mills and Boon novel. They settled in Brittany, and she lived out her remaining years at Hennebont Castle. While she was never able to take personal revenge on Charles de Blois, her last surviving son by Oliver would finally bring down their old enemy. Charles de Blois had been ransomed from England and had returned to a Brittany still divided between his forces and those of his great rival, John de Montfort. Soon the war was back on, and Jeanne's son, also called Oliver, helped lead the joint Anglo-Breton army that finally defeated de Blois. Charles was mortally injured during the fighting. Legend has it that, as his life slipped away, he screamed that he could hear a woman's mocking laughter and that he could see a black ship with crimson sails coming for his soul. Oliver the Younger would make peace with the French monarchy, who, to bury the hatchet and end the feud, posthumously reinstated the honours of his father, allowing his relatives to regain the rights and privileges their family's nobility had once provided them. In time he would become the constable of all France, though he earned the nickname the Butcher for his ferocity in battle and tendency not to take prisoners. He was a chip off the old block. Somewhere, I'm sure the Bloody Lioness of Brittany was proud of her son. Thanks for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. If there's a war you'd like me to cover, please send me an email on bartonjames84@proton.m for mother, E for echo. In the next episode, we are going to meet the worst traitor in American history. It's an extraordinary tale of a man who tried to undermine George Washington, sold out the infant republic to the Spanish, and was trying to get the famous explorers Lewis and Clark killed. To top it all off, he achieved the remarkable feat of destroying an American army that he commanded in peacetime without a shot being fired, and then completely disrupted America's invasion of Canada in 1812. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.